Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time we're playing Gunbreaker on a Saturday evening. And this set was weirdly inverse of what we had last week. Mostly leveling in high level dungeons and, oh, of course, MSQ roulettes. Speaking of which, for Duty 1 we start with Porta Decumana, and it should probably come as no surprise, not very much happened here. However, it does offer a decent opportunity to talk about defensive cooldown cycling in a boss fight. If a boss fight doesn't really call for a lot of defensive cooldowns from the tank at all, then it opens up for the opportunity to cycle defensive cooldowns to reduce the overall damage taken. Rampart to reduce, say, 4 or 5 auto attacks can be pretty significant overall, and is a lot better than not using Rampart because no tank busters called for it. Admittedly, this is rarely necessary in casual difficulty content like Porta Decumana, but everything helps, and it isn't a bad habit to build considering it can be outright necessary if you graduate to tanking savage bosses. This is also the reason why I use my various defensive cooldowns somewhat randomly throughout this fight. On a completely different note, as is tradition with MSQ Roulette, I was thinking, if Final Fantasy XIV jobs were Pokemon, I could imagine all 4 tanks would probably be some combo involving steel. A bit in the same way that I sort of imagine all 4 healers would include either Fairy or Psychic. With that in mind, I imagine Paladin would be Steel Fairy, with Fairy being used as the stand-in for Light. Dark Knight would be Steel Dark, of course. Warrior would be Steel Fighting, as it isn't uncommon for angry and raging Pokemon to be fighting types. And then I suppose Gunbreaker could be Steel Fire for the explosions. For Duty 2, we went to Dragon's Neck, for those that see this and go, what on earth is this? This is one of the Hildibrand trials, and it is quite ridiculous. The fight is a bit strange, I'd call it bordering on bugged actually. Let me explain. Typhon uses various attacks that can push you, and if you get pushed off the arena, you're down for the count for a few seconds before you can simply hop back on again. This is expected. If everyone gets ringed out at the same time, you wipe. The vast majority of Typhon's attacks can be dodged or will not hit everyone at the same time though, so this is rarely a problem. Ultros, on the other hand, attacks a lot more normally. At specific times in the fight, all of the DPS players will be turned into imps, and being hit by Ultros' water attacks will build a buff on you that you can hold up to 2 of. When Typhon moves to the center to perform its Severe Snort, it will also gain 8 stacks of a buff, and if an imp with stacks of their buff from Ultros attacks Typhon at this time, their stacks will be spent to reduce Typhon's buff, and if it drops to 0, Severe Snort is interrupted. The intention, I believe, is that if you don't stop the Severe Snort, you lose, as Severe Snort pushes everyone back. The reality though is that if you stand under Typhon, you can take the full knockback without falling off the arena. And knockback immunity also works, making this mechanic only remotely relevant if it manages to happen twice. Naturally, as you need Ultras to stop Typhon, the bosses will share HP with each other somewhat frequently between mechanics, but given this, I would almost say oversight or bug, it doesn't really matter. For Duty 3, we went to Castrum Meridianum, and, well, of course not much happened here either. More cycling defensives on boss fights, I suppose. In regards to how the tank Pokemon would work, I imagine a Paladin would emphasize blocking with moves similar to Aegislash's King's Shield. Warrior would absolutely have something like Drain Punch. I imagine Dark Knight would have attacks with recoil on them, and then perhaps an ability that emphasized that in some way or another. And Gunbreaker could be designed as a sort of revenge killer with moves that go first, and something like Overheat, although I guess this would make more sense if Overheat was physical. Maybe if it had an ability that made special moves also scale with physical attacks. That sounds very overpowered though. Anyway, the reason why I go on these talks about something unrelated to the duty is mostly because it feels like a shame to not show any of the duty just because it was easy, but if there's nothing to talk about, there's nothing to talk about. I guess there's one thing to talk about in regards to Castrum Meridianum. I feel like the duty is a lot shorter than it feels. A total length of about 15 minutes, including cutscenes, but certainly, because of the cutscenes and the ease of the duty, it can feel like it takes 30 minutes. For Duty 4, we went to Sunken Temple of Qarn, hard, and it was a generally solid group. On the first Vicegerent hand thingy, it seemed like the team didn't quite grasp why it needed to be focused down fast. This unfortunately led to me being petrified since I couldn't turn to face away from the gaze, and by extension, I could not dodge the laser even after the hand was removed as a result. It is possible this simply happened because the mechanic sort of got jumped on our team, but I also like to imagine the second time this kind of mechanic came about, the team was much faster to react because one of our damage dealers got grabbed just before the first one died. A case of, oh, that's why it matters. A tip for the final boss. It is stunnable, and using a stun whenever the boss decides to do something inconvenient can be very handy. Although, near the end of the fight, the boss will use a beam on a party member that you would very much like to stop. And apparently, this is also stopped by stuns. So try not to stun it too many times so it builds immunity at that point. Also, of course, just a general tip, try to avoid the wall of mummies running at you. It isn't fun to be crowd controlled for the majority of the fight. For Duty 5, we went to Amdapor Keep, which is one of those dungeons with barely any walls at all, so you can just keep pulling to your heart's desire almost. In this group, however, I got the impression that the healer was not attacking very much at all, often casting just physic as well. And while the dancer sometimes came in for an AoE attack, they spent quite a lot of time out of range for this, meaning our AoE damage output was severely lacking. Because of this, I split up the pulls in smaller portions. To actually do this kind of giga pull, you sort of need everyone behind you to be AoEing the pack as you run, so most of it dies off on the way. And you absolutely need everyone to be AoEing once you reach the destination. So if this isn't happening, then it is quite likely pulling everything will result in a wipe. By the first boss, I also felt we had quite low damage output since the big rock golem actually made it to us and managed to do a few things. On the second boss, we also got a hilarious reminder that the repel mechanic pushes you back from the boss, but the knockback is a circle. After the second boss, it seems the monk also got tired of the fact I was pulling smaller, as they eventually took matters into their own hands, forgetting that while they have a gap closer, I don't. So even had I wanted to keep up with them, I wouldn't be able to, and so they died. On the final boss, we also almost had mechanics do something meaningful due to the length of the fight. It is still very funny that a spell named Imminent Catastrophe doesn't do any more than this. Also, this can be blocked with the statues, it just doesn't do enough damage to bother these days. For Duty 6, we went to Baelsar's Wall. Oh look, it's Nathan from the Temple of Qarn run earlier. The first mega pull in this dungeon is particularly brutal. The flying machines chain themselves to one player and do damage to specifically them. They also chase the player around, so that player should try to stick with the tank so that the machine gets cleaved down with the rest of the blob. There are also ranged mobs in the pool, so the tank needs to adjust their positioning around them so everything goes down together. It is also a rather big pull in general, so this has to happen while dealing with the large incoming damage. I would say the hardest part is for the healer who has to both maintain the tank and also keep an eye on anyone else who's taking damage from the flyers. The second boss also has one of the more obtuse mechanics in the game. Dynamic Sensory Jammer puts a debuff on everyone. If you are actively doing something, when it hits 0, you get hit hard and knocked into the air. This is effectively Acceleration Bomb, but without the dice ticking down above your head. However, unlike Acceleration Bomb, this debuff seems to be a lot more finicky, and while normally stopping all action and movement when the timer hits 1 tends to be fine, for Dynamic Sensory Jammer, I recommend stopping when it hits 2 to be sure. What makes the mechanic particularly confusing is that the tooltip is a bit misleading, as it says it punishes you for acting, but it doesn't clarify that it only applies at one specific time. So make sure you are not doing anything, untarget the boss and stop moving. An auto attack can count too, you know. An interesting little side note about the final boss is that he will not chain anyone if there's only one player, which makes this dungeon soloable by a warrior, although both the first and second bosses have attacks that hit incredibly hard, including percentage-based attacks, which makes it so hard I would argue you need a lot of luck to even have a chance. For Duty 7, we went to Short Death the King, and as I have mentioned before, the most dangerous mobs here by far, like it isn't even remotely close, are the marshmallows, because they can sleep you. That alone isn't a problem, but if you're not the tank, then you will only be woken up by AoE damage from the bombs. And if you are the healer, well, there's an extremely high chance you were the only one that could remove the sleep, unless you have a bard. However, not only is the sleep interruptible, but the marshmallows are stunnable, so if you are the tank, or your tank is awake, most of the sleep casts can simply be denied. However, ignoring this can make this guild test the one where players might actually die from legitimate damage. For duty 8, we went to Between the Helmets, and well, you know how it goes. Not much happens here. We have the same Reaper from the previous guild test though, so I think we're both trapped here. For duty 9, we went to Castrum, Abania. On the first boss, you use this cannon thing to stop the boss from charging around. It deals a rather pathetic amount of damage, so it never occurred to me to keep using the cannon after stopping the boss. Our black mage tried it though. From what I can tell, either it does an okay amount of damage between all these numbers I can see, or it does no damage. Either way, it doesn't look to be worth it. On the second boss, we almost wiped when one of the towers were not soaked. Fortunately, this happened late enough in the fight that we could just barely bring home the victory. Thank you, Super Bolide. I don't recall these towers hurting that much when you miss them though. Wow! Our healer apologized for being DPS brained, but looking back at what happened, I don't think that was their fault. Remember everyone, if you stand in the tower, stay in the tower until it resolves. The rest of the group assumes you will. I would also say it was a bit strange how many times the healer used Medica 1 instead of Medica 2, but that wasn't why people died. Finally, for duty 10, we went to Copperbell Mines, and look, turns out Nalay knew me. Hello! This isn't always the nicest thing to do if you have sprouts in the group, but Copperbell Mines is very strange. The first long hallway bit you can reasonably safely just sprint through, as many of the mobs will, for whatever reason, reset after you go past a certain point, so you will only have to fight about half of the pull at the destination. I do also recommend, as what follows after will not require defensive cooldowns, that you quite aggressively use everything you have as a tank. You can even kite the mobs if you're worrying that things are going badly, although it will reduce the damage you as a tank can do somewhat. Because each section of the dungeon is rather long too, even if you pull everything, if your group has the capacity to do damage while running, even better with AoE, most of the pack will be dead or close to by the time you reach your destination, allowing you to rush through the dungeon extremely fast. A general tip for pulling big as a tank in low-level dungeons is to keep an eye on what kind of group you have. If your healer is a white mage, then they don't really have any healing options while running with you at this low level, so it is extra important that you keep a lead on the mob so you don't take a bunch of damage while running. If your damage dealers are black mages, they can't do very good damage while running either. They can do some damage, but it is sort of roundabout and unlikely the black mages will. Other casters may also have trouble doing much damage following along, but aside from that, the rest of the DPS jobs should be able to attack, if not outright AoE in the case of ranged physical, which can make gigapulls like these a lot safer. I mean, sure, these dungeons are not that hard, and a Gunbreaker can solo them rather easily, not even requiring a full set of equipment to do so, but there is a difference between being able to do this alone and being able to run it quickly, and pulling all of that may require a full team. A rather easy set this time around. As I've noticed before, it does seem a lot more likely that tanks, and especially healers, get more mundane duties, as groups for regular roulettes like leveling almost always needs tanks and healers. Meanwhile, because DPS are less frequently needed in these duties, DPS Mentor Roulette tends to queue for longer and get more unusual duties, like extremes, simply because that's the duty that needed them. I really do wish I could get a more mixed bag sometimes instead of the sets often being very concentrated on a specific kind of duty. That said, we did at least have some variety and not just the same duties over and over again this time around. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, currently, all jobs have a 10% chance to parry physical attacks. Parrying reduces damage by 15%. Before Stormblood, parry was an actual stat you could have. This was eventually replaced with tenacity. I'm not entirely sure how useful parry actually was back then, but Dark Knights had actions that relied on parrying to be accessible. Why is this relevant for Gunbreaker? Because Camouflage adds plus 50% chance to parry. making your chance 60%.